Hey, it's Alex from Last Climb, and today I'm breaking down the Manaslu climb, where a TikToker's unchecked arrogance and a fabricated summit claim sent entire expeditions straight into disaster. Her selfish obsession with content drove a lie that poisoned every decision on one of the highest places on Earth. And the truth I uncovered about who paid for it, and the aftermath that followed, will break your heart. It was October 2nd, 2019, at Manaslu Base Camp, where the late afternoon sun had turned the glacial moraine into a wet mess of loose stone and melting ice. The temperature sat around 34 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough for puddles to form between tent platforms. Prayer flags hung between bamboo poles in limp clusters, barely moving in the still air. The camp sprawled across a broad shelf at roughly 15,750 feet on the north side of the mountain. Dozens of tents in varying states of organization, each cluster belonging to a different expedition company, the smell of kerosene and Dow mixed with the mineral tang of glacial runoff. Among the climbers staged at base camp was Sienna Price, a 25-year-old from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her TikTok following sat at roughly 50,000, modest by mainstream standards, but growing fast on the platform's early wave of adventure content. Her brand was built on a simple premise: fearless girl proves doubters wrong. The videos followed a formula: dramatic music over shaky footage, voiceover narration about overcoming fear and pushing limits, captions designed to trigger engagement through controversy and admiration in equal measure. She had climbed Kilimanjaro the previous year and Island Peak 3 months before Manaslu, both on fully guided trips where logistics, route finding, and risk management were handled entirely by support staff. Her content from those climbs framed the experiences as personal conquests. The Sherpas and guides who made the ascents possible appeared occasionally in her footage, but were never identified by name. I kept coming back to this: a Kilimanjaro trek and an Island Peak climb. That was the entire resume she brought to an 8,000-meter peak. Manaslu was her breakout play. At 26,781 feet, it was the 8th highest mountain on Earth, a legitimate 8,000-meter peak with a fatality rate that commanded respect. Summiting would separate her from the dozens of other adventure creators filming themselves on trekking peaks. She had paid a premium fee to join a commercial expedition operated by a Kathmandu-based company, securing a dedicated Sherpa guide and full logistical support. That guide was Chewang Rangdol, 36 years old, from the Rolwaling Valley east of Kathmandu. Chewang had spent 14 seasons working on 8,000-meter peaks: Everest 4 times, Lhotse twice, Maksalu, Cho Oyu, Dhaulagiri, and Manaslu 3 times before this season. He was known among expedition operators for a specific quality: he turned clients around. Where other Sherpas allowed clients to push beyond safe limits, either from client pressure, company pressure, or the financial incentive of summit bonuses, Chewang made conservative calls and defended them. He had turned back clients within 500 vertical feet of summits when conditions deteriorated, absorbing their anger with the patience of someone who understood that reputation was built across seasons, not single climbs. He was quiet by nature and possessed the weathered competence of a man who had spent more cumulative hours above 25,000 feet than most climbers spent above 15,000. When I found out how many seasons this man had on these mountains, 14 years of reading clients, reading weather, reading terrain, it made what comes next that much harder to sit with. His assessment of Sienna had formed within the first week. She was physically adequate, but technically limited, with no real experience managing herself on steep ice. Her focus on content creation interfered with acclimatization rhythms. She delayed departures for camera angles, stopped at exposed positions to film, and treated rest days as production sessions. None of this was unusual for commercial clients. What concerned him was the gap between her actual ability and the narrative she was broadcasting. Her content described a climber operating at the edge of human performance. The reality was a moderately fit woman who needed to be short-roped on terrain steeper than 40 degrees. And that gap between what her audience saw and what was actually happening on the mountain, that's the whole story right there. Camped roughly 200 yards from Sienna's expedition was a smaller outfit. Among their clients was Merrick Adler, 33, a high school earth sciences teacher from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Merrick had saved for 4 years to afford Manaslu, setting aside portions of a teacher's salary that left little room for the kind kind of spending most 8,000-meter climbers took for granted. His climbing resume was modest in volume, but serious in character. He had summited Denali via the West Buttress 2 years earlier, and before that, he had attempted Cho Oyu and voluntarily turned back at 24,600 feet when weather deteriorated, a decision he described without regret to anyone who asked. That willingness to turn around told experienced climbers everything they needed to know about his judgment. At base camp, Merrick was the kind of presence that drew people in without effort. He ate meals with the Sherpa kitchen staff when invited, asked questions about their families and home villages, and carried his own loads between camps when the terrain allowed it. He had spent weeks before the expedition learning basic Nepali phrases and the correct pronunciation of his Sherpas' names, small gestures that were noticed and appreciated by people accustomed to being treated as interchangeable labor. His students back in Green Bay had followed the expedition through. Updates he emailed from base camp whenever satellite connectivity allowed, and he carried a small banner they had signed that he planned to photograph at the summit. That's the kind of climber you root for, and that's exactly what makes the rest of this so difficult. The acclimatization rotations through September and early October proceeded normally for both climbers. Teams moved upward through the camp structure, Camp 1 at roughly 18,700 feet, Camp 2 at 21,000 feet, Camp 3 at 22,300 feet, climbing high and sleeping low in the iterative process that allowed bodies to adapt to diminishing oxygen. Sienna struggled more than her content revealed. At Camp 2, she vomited repeatedly and needed extended rest before continuing. Above Camp 3, on steep ice leading toward Camp 4, Che Wang short-roped her through sections where her crampon technique was insufficient to maintain safe purchase on hard blue ice. Her videos from those rotations showed none of this, only the carefully selected angles that framed her as confident and capable against dramatic backdrops. From everything I found, her audience had no idea how close she came to being pulled off the mountain before the summit push even started. Merrick performed well on his rotations. His pace was steady, his appetite held, and his expedition leader considered him one of the strongest clients in the group. The contrast between Merrick and Sienna was visible to anyone paying attention at base camp, though the two rarely interacted beyond brief greetings. By early October, the autumn weather window was narrowing. Forecasts predicted a high-pressure system arriving around the first week of October, offering roughly 2 to 3 days of reduced wind and clear skies before a storm moved in from the west. Expedition leaders across base camp began finalizing summit strategies and staging oxygen at higher camps. Sienna's expedition departed base camp for the summit push in the first week of October. They reached Camp 4 at approximately 24,300 feet the following afternoon, resting through the evening before departing for the summit sometime around 1 a.m. the next morning. The night was cold, roughly minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with moderate wind and clear visibility. A line of headlamps stretched up the slope above Camp 4 as teams from multiple expeditions climbed toward the summit. Sienna moved adequately through the first hours, her supplemental oxygen and the adrenaline of summit day providing a boost that masked the deficiencies Che Wang had been managing for weeks. But above 25,000 feet, the deficit began to show. Her pace dropped. She stopped more frequently, leaning heavily on her ice axe with each pause, her breathing audible even through her oxygen mask. Her crampon placements became imprecise, scraping and readjust where a confident climber would plant and trust. Che Wang watched these changes with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed the progression many times before. He also watched the sky. And based on everything I found, this is the moment the story splits, because what Che Wang saw in those clouds is what should have saved everyone. To the south, clouds were building along the ridgeline, in formations that experienced high-altitude climbers learned to read like text. Lenticular caps forming over neighboring peaks, a haze creeping up the valley that suggested moisture arriving ahead of schedule. The forecast had predicted the window would hold, but Che Wang had spent enough seasons above 25,000 feet to know that forecasts were educated guesses and the sky was primary data. At roughly 25,800 feet, sometime around early morning, Che Wang made the call. Sienna needed to turn around. Her deteriorating physical state and the weather signs made continued ascent inadvisable. The summit was still roughly 1,000 vertical feet above them, 2 to 3 hours in her current condition. That timeline would put them high on the mountain precisely when the weather arrived. Sienna resisted. Che Wang did not engage in debate at 25,800 feet. He communicated through the economy that altitude demanded they were going down. She protested, but Chewang had managed this response before and knew that it rarely survived the first 10 minutes of descent. They began descending shortly after. And I want to be clear about something here. This was the right call. By every measure, Chewang did exactly what a 14-season veteran should do. The problem wasn't the turnaround, it was what happened after it. On the way down, Sienna filmed. At multiple points, she stopped to capture footage, herself against steep terrain, the route stretching above and below, clouds moving across neighboring peaks. The visibility was deteriorating, but still offered dramatic backdrops. The footage was shot in the vertical format her audience expected, with angles that showed exposure without revealing identifiable features that would confirm her altitude. At roughly 25,800 feet in swirling cloud, the mountain looked like the summit to anyone who had never been there. They reached Camp 4 by late morning and continued descending to Camp 3 at around 22,300 feet, arriving in the early afternoon. Chewang reported the turnaround accurately to his expedition leader via radio, standard procedure. His company knew Sienna had not summited. Camp 3 was crowded. Climbers from other expeditions were staged there, preparing for their own summit pushes the following day. Among them were members of Merrick's expedition, who had taken a more conservative approach and planned to push from Camp 4 the next day. Merrick himself was at Camp 3, resting and hydrating, preparing for the climb to Camp 4 the following morning. And this is where the two timelines collide, because what Sienna was about to do at Camp 3 would reach Merrick's expedition before the weather ever could. What happened at Camp 3 over the following hours was reconstructed from statements by multiple climbers. Sienna, energized by the descent to a more comfortable altitude, moved between tent clusters talking to climbers from other expeditions. She described reaching the summit. She described conditions near the top as challenging but manageable, wind present but not dangerous, visibility adequate. She was specific in ways that sounded credible to people who had no reason to doubt her. The claim spread through camp the way information moves at altitude, repeated between tents, mentioned over meals, absorbed into the collective understanding of conditions on the mountain. And this is the part that got to me when I was piecing this together. She wasn't just lying about herself. She was feeding bad information into decisions that other people's lives depended on. Hey, quick reminder that if this kind of in-depth storytelling matters to you, subscribing and leaving a like goes a long way. These mountains carry more history than most people realize. Now, let's get back to the mountain. Chewang was present at Camp 3 during this period. By multiple accounts, he was within earshot of at least 2 exchanges where Sienna described summiting. He did not contradict her. Publicly contradicting a client in front of other expeditions would humiliate the client, damage the guiding company's reputation, and jeopardize his future employment. His obligation was to report accurately to his own company, which he had done. What a client told other people was, within the professional framework he operated in, not his responsibility to police. And I understand the professional logic behind that, but understanding it doesn't make it sit any easier. That assumption proved wrong. Merrick's expedition leader was weighing a marginal decision. His paid weather service showed the window holding through the following morning, but with deterioration likely by afternoon. His own Sherpas were split. 2 recommended pushing, 1 expressed. Reservations about cloud formations he had observed, similar to what Chewang had seen hours earlier. Into that uncertainty, the fresh summit report tipped the balance. A climber had reportedly summited that morning and described conditions as holdable. The report was not the sole factor. It never is on an 8,000-meter peak, but for a leader already leaning toward go, it resolved the ambiguity. Merrick's team would push to Camp 4 the following day and attempt the summit the morning after. Other expeditions made similar calculations. Stay with me here, because from this point forward, the weather is making every decision. Merrick departed Camp 3 the next morning in good spirits. He climbed strongly to Camp 4, arriving in the early afternoon with his Sherpa support team, a lead guide, and an assistant Sherpa who had worked 4 seasons on 8,000-meter peaks. They rested through the afternoon, melted snow, and prepared equipment. At Camp 4, the wind was already stronger than the Bonnie forecast suggested. Gusts rattled tent fabric with force. Several experienced Sherpas exchanged looks that communicated what words did not. The window was closing earlier than predicted, but expeditions were committed. The institutional momentum of a summit push, once initiated, was difficult to reverse. Merrick's team departed Camp 4 sometime around 1 a.m. The wind was steady at roughly 30 miles per hour, with gusts reaching higher, strong enough to require bracing on exposed sections. Visibility was adequate but deteriorating, high clouds dimming the stars, creating a diffused moonlight that made terrain harder to read. Other teams were also climbing, their headlamps forming a scattered line on the route. For the first few hours, Merrick climbed steadily. His pace was slower than his acclimatization rotations had suggested. The wind and cold demanded additional energy, but he remained coordinated and alert. His Sherpas monitored him and saw nothing that warranted concern. They passed 25,000 feet sometime before dawn. By early morning, the deterioration that Chewang had predicted days earlier arrived in full. Wind increased sharply, jumping from gusts to sustained force that made upright movement dangerous. Visibility collapsed as clouds engulfed the upper mountain, reducing the world to a few meters of swirling gray. Temperature dropped into a range where exposed skins suffered frostbite within minutes. Teams that had been climbing in a loose line were suddenly isolated in whiteout, each group reduced to the small circle of visibility around their headlamps. I've covered enough of these to know, when the mountain decides the window is closed, there's no negotiating with it. The lead Sherpa on Merrick's team made the call to retreat immediately. They had reached approximately 25,400 feet. The summit was over 1,300 vertical feet above them, and the conditions made continued ascent suicidal. Merrick did not argue. He understood weather, and he understood the math. They began descending. The descent should have been straightforward. Fixed ropes marked the route, and they had climbed the same terrain hours earlier. But the storm was erasing the mountain's features. Blowing snow buried the fixed lines. Visibility reduced to arm's length. Finding each anchor point required digging through accumulating snow and tracing the rope by feel. At approximately 25,100 feet, the assistant Sherpa moved ahead to locate the next section of fixed rope. He unclipped from the line to traverse a short section where the rope had been buried under ice and debris. In adequate visibility, the traverse was routine, 10 meters across mixed terrain. In whiteout, it was a gamble that depended on memory the storm had already compromised. He did not return. The lead Sherpa waited as long as conditions permitted, calling into the wind, then continued descending with Merrick on the fixed line they had confirmed. Merrick and his lead Sherpa continued descending through the storm. Each anchor transition required excavating rope from under snow and moving to the next point. Merrick's hands were losing function despite heavy gloves, the cold and fine motor demands of manipulating carabiners on frozen ropes overwhelming his circulation. His lead Sherpa managed the technical work at each anchor, clipping and unclipping for both of them, while the wind tore at their bodies. At approximately 24,800 feet, Merrick collapsed. The lead Sherpa later described the moment. One step he was moving, the next he was on his knees in the snow, folding forward as though a switch had been turned off. The Sherpa checked his oxygen. Functioning, flow adequate. The collapse was systemic. Hours of extreme exertion in storm conditions had pushed his body past a threshold that supplemental oxygen could not compensate for. The lead Sherpa attempted to get him moving. He pulled at his harness, shouted into the wind, tried to lift him. Merrick responded with sluggish movements that produced no forward progress. The lead Sherpa faced the calculation that every Sherpa above 25,000 feet understood. The arithmetic of rescue at extreme altitude, where the weight of a body and the angle of a mountain formed an equation that rarely solved in favor of survival. He stayed with Merrick for over 40 minutes. When Merrick stopped responding entirely, the Sherpa descended to Camp 4 alone, arriving after dark in a state of exhaustion and frostbite that required immediate attention. His report confirmed 2 missing, the assistant Sherpa and Merrick Adler, and that's what I can't get past. Merrick did everything right. Turned back on Cho Oyu, climbed conservatively, respected every protocol. None of it mattered because someone else's lie put him on that slope a day too late. When news of the crisis reached Camp 3 via radio traffic, Chewang Rangdol understood what the fragmented reports meant before the details were confirmed. He had watched the weather build for 2 days. He had watched Sienna's lie spread through Camp 3. He had said nothing. The connection between his silence and the teams now dying above him was not a certainty. No single factor had caused the disaster, but it was a possibility that settled into him with a weight that altitude alone could not explain. At first light the following morning, Chewang joined a group of Sherpas organizing rescue operations from Camp 3. The storm had weakened, wind reduced to roughly 20 miles per hour, visibility improved to several hundred meters, but conditions remained dangerous above 24,000 feet. Chewang climbed back toward Camp 4 with the rescue group, reaching it by mid-morning. He worked for roughly 9 hours in exposed conditions above Camp 4. He helped carry an injured climber from another expedition down steep terrain. He dug through snow searching for buried equipment and people. Multiple times, he removed his gloves to manipulate frozen carabiners and knot systems that insulated fabric made impossible to operate. The cold destroyed tissue in his fingers with a progression he was experienced enough to recognize, but chose to ignore. By the time Chewang descended to Camp 4 that evening, both hands were severely frostbitten. The skin had turned white and waxy, sensation was gone, and the swelling that followed over the next hours confirmed the damage was deep. This is the detail that stayed with me longest. He could have remained at Camp 3. He'd already done his job. Instead, he climbed back into the storm to try and fix what his silence helped cause, and the mountain took his hands for it. The assistant Sherpa was found 2 days later, roughly 100 meters off the fixed line, at 25,100 feet. He had fallen approximately 200 feet down a snow slope and sustained injuries consistent with a tumbling fall. He had not survived. Merrick Adler was found roughly 2 days after the storm at approximately 24,800 feet, seated in the snow where his Sherpa had last seen him. Ice had formed over his clothing and oxygen mask. The banner his students had signed was in the chest pocket of his down suit. Conditions prevented safe recovery of either body. The investigation that followed identified multiple contributing factors: a weather window that closed earlier than forecast, aggressive timing by several expedition leaders, and communication failures between teams. Investigators specifically noted that a false summit report contributed to other teams' decision-making during a period of forecast uncertainty. No sole blame was assigned. No criminal charges were filed. Several climbers from other expeditions caught in the same storm suffered frostbite injuries requiring evacuation. At least 2 never returned to high-altitude climbing. Sienna Price's summit claim unraveled within weeks. GPS tracking data from her expedition showed her high point at approximately 25,800 feet, nearly 1,000 feet below the summit. Climbers who had been above that altitude on the same day confirmed they had never seen her higher. Her TikTok and Instagram accounts were deleted. She issued no public statement. She returned to Arizona and disappeared from the climbing and social media communities entirely. She had descended Manaslu without a scratch. Chewang Rangdol lost 3 fingers on his left hand and 2 on his right. The amputations were performed in Kathmandu roughly 2 weeks after the expedition. The hands that had spent 14 seasons fixing ropes, setting anchors, and guiding clients on the highest mountains on Earth could no longer grip an ice axe or operate the hardware that high-altitude work demanded. Those who spoke with him in the months that followed described a man who carried something heavier than the physical loss, a belief impossible to confirm or disprove, that speaking up at Camp 3 might have changed the calculation for the teams that pushed into the storm. He did not return to expedition work, and to me, that's the part that never sits right. She walked off that mountain without a scratch. Chewang lost his fingers. Merrick's students lost their teacher, and the system just moved on.